Support for Pod Virginia comes from the Virginia Poverty Law Center, the Virginia League of Conservation Voters Education Fund, and Patreons who are listeners like you.
I'm Michael Pope, and this is Pod Virginia, a podcast that is enjoying the great outdoors today. We're about to head out to a Virginia nature triathlon with a man who set out to walk, ride, and paddle across the Commonwealth. He has a new book out next week about his journey. He's one of the few people on the planet who can actually claim the title His Excellency, but on the Appalachian Trail, they call him Dog Bowl. Senator Tim Kaine, thanks for joining us.
Michael, I can't wait to talk to you about my journey. Good to be with you.
Great. Well, so the title of your new book is Walk, Ride, Paddle, A Life Outside, which is published by Harper Horizon. Now, ostensibly, the idea is pretty simple. You would hike the Appalachian Trail, cycle Skyline Drive, and paddle the James River, then journal about your experience. But that's only part of the story, because along the way, you share your thoughts about your first statewide campaign running for lieutenant governor, your approach to the harmonica, your thoughts about Jesus, your worries about being a good father, and what it's like campaigning on the national stage with Hillary Clinton. Tim Kaine, why did you write this book?
Well, it started as a project to celebrate turning 60 and 25 years in public life. So I turned 60 in 2018 in the middle of a re-election campaign, so I couldn't really celebrate that year. But I said, when I'm done with this campaign, win or lose, I'm going to do something special to celebrate turning 60 in 25 years since my first city council race. The idea just popped into my head, Michael. After that race was over, why not create a nature quest that's Virginia-based? My sister and brother-in-law in New York and their kids had done something called the 46ers, which is there's 46 peaks in the Adirondacks higher than 4,000 feet. And some New Yorkers just make it a quest to do all of them. And John and Taylor did it with their kids and dogs. There's a similar quest in Colorado to climb the 14ers, all the peaks that are higher than 14,000 feet. So I thought, I want to create one of these quests for Virginia. What would it be? And then I thought, well, okay, walk, ride, paddle. Walk on the 560 miles of the Appalachian Trail from Harpers Ferry to Tennessee. Cycle from the Virginia-North Carolina border on the Blue Ridge Parkway and Skyline Drive all the way to Front Royal, and then canoe the whole James River. So this is my love letter to Virginia. My home of 40 years is to create this quest and do it. And I kept a journal thinking I might write about it, thinking that maybe somebody would be interested. But I think what kind of turned it into something more than just an account of each day's journey is between when I started, May of 2019, and when I finished, I was a juror in 2 impeachment trials, attack on the Capitol, COVID and long COVID, the murder of George Floyd, contested presidential election. The nature journey became the kind of window through which I was looking at this unusual chapter in American life. And it was also what I was not just thinking about, but talking with people about along the way. So it's a weird mixture of a nature journey and a political reflection and Virginia history and conversations with companions and passersby. So why did I write it? To challenge myself at a milestone in birthday and a milestone in my public life, and to get to know my Commonwealth even better.
Now, I opened with this joke about that you're one of the few people on the planet that can claim the title His Excellency, but on the Appalachian Trail, they call you Dog Bowl. So I actually was not aware of this tradition of having the trail names. You hang out with people who call themselves Boomer, Magic, Tracker, Underdog, Redbush, Choo Choo, Cotton, Boxcar Willie, Lumberjack, Pac-Man. Talk a little bit about these names and explain your nickname of Dog Bowl.
So on the trail, it's kind of a democratizing thing. You're wearing the same clothes day after day. You're not shaving. You don't smell very good. And you use a trail name rather than your actual name. And the tradition on the trail is you have to be given the name. You can't choose the name. So for the first few weeks I was doing this on the trail, I would introduce myself as TK. Again, every once in a while somebody would recognize me. Most often they wouldn't, again, in hiking clothes, not shaven for a while. But I had a hack that I thought was great. I carried a collapsible dog bowl with me that every time I'd get to a stream, I'd fill that up. That would be a sink that I could use to wash my face or wash some socks out or something like that. And somebody who hiked with me a couple days saw it, and then the first day thought it was a cool hack. And then the second day thought I was a little too proud of something that was somewhat obvious. and just bestowed upon me the name Dog Bull. And so from that point, everywhere I went, I just introduced myself as Dog Bull. And my dog had passed away. Gina, our family dog, had died not long before the hike. And her Dog Bowl was still sitting on the floor next to the kitchen table as a little reminder to us. That's not the bowl I used on the trail. I brought my own Dog Bowl. But anyway, it just seemed like, yeah, that's a good nickname. So I stuck with it.
So your book kind of reminded me of Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, which is ostensibly about a motorcycle journey from Minnesota to California. Along the way, the author talks about everything from epistemology to the history of philosophy to the semantics of science. It also kind of reminded me of the quirky habit of journaling that was the hallmark of former Florida Senator Bob Graham, who was also a governor and found himself in the Senate. And he would journal things like how long it took to rewind a VHS tape, that sort of thing. There's also, of course, hints of Henry David Thoreau and Life on the Woods. Senator Kaine, what were your influences for this book, and where do you see it fitting into the canon of American nonfiction?
I would say I love that you thought about Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance. That's a book that I absolutely love, and I hadn't thought about for probably 20 years. And so that was not in my mind writing this book.
There are lots of obvious parallels between that book and your book.
When you say it, it's like, yeah, I guess I can see it, because you're right. It's a journey, but it's much more than the journey. I would say the biggest influence on my thinking about this was A Week on the Concord and Merrimack Rivers by Thoreau. That's one of my favorite books. And it's an amazing story. Thoreau and his brother just put in a boat. I think they built the boat and they filled it up with watermelons and food from their garden. They put in the boat in Concord and they canoed down the Concord River to the confluence with the Merrimack. And then they take the boat upstream on the Merrimack into New Hampshire. And it's just a week-long journey. Thoreau kept notes about the journey, but didn't do anything with it for many years. His brother died. But this is what Thoreau worked on when he was at Walden. So we know Thoreau Walden is his most known work. But he didn't write Walden until after his sojourn there. What he did at Walden was take the notes of this river journey and he wrote it up. And each day is the journey and his reflections on his brother. It's an elegy to his brother who's passed, on the nature of friendship, issues going on in the country at the time. I would say that book was the one thing I really thought about. And then the other thing to some degree is Teddy Roosevelt. Teddy Roosevelt wrote a lot of nature literature when he was in public office. He wrote about his time with the Rough Riders. He wrote about his time in the Dakotas. He wrote about hunting trips and things that he would take. When Teddy Roosevelt found out that he was going to be president, he was camping in the Adirondacks. McKinley had been shot. Teddy had gone to Buffalo to see the president, thought the president was recovering, then went camping in the mountains of the Adirondack Mountains. And the Secret Service had to run up a trail and inform him that he was now president of the United States. He wrote a lot about nature while he was in public office. And I guess I was thinking, a lot of my colleagues write books that, like, I'm introducing myself to the American public because I might be your president one day. The political books kind of fit into a fairly narrow straitjacket these days. I'm a politician, but this isn't that kind of book. It is a nature book. And I would say the Thoreau and then the Teddy Roosevelt books were the things that were probably on my mind as I was writing it.
Well, actually, you've just raised a lot of interesting issues right there about, like, where do you put this book in the bookstore, right? Is it in the politics section? If you are the publisher and you're looking to market it, I mean, like, what kind of book is this? I mean, it's because if you're looking for a political book, it's not too political. If you're looking for a nature book, it maybe is too political.
Yeah.
And how did you tell me about striking that balance? Because there's the immediate where you're talking about paddling, for example, and then you like recall your first campaign for the Richmond City Council, and then you go back to the trail of the Appalachian Trail, and then you're talking about what it's like to be in the insurrection, you know,
or a trip with my kids 20 years ago in the same stretch, and you know how it compares to now. What is this book? I wrote the whole book with no agent or publisher. I wanted to write it my way. And then I thought, obviously, if somebody's interested, I'm going to have an editor who'll make it better. But I wanted to do it my way. And I struck out with 2 agents before I found one who said, I like this, but it just doesn't fit. It doesn't fit into a niche. And you're going to have a hard time getting this published. I found my way to Suzanne Gluck at WME, who's my agent. And she said, well, I've never done a book with a politician before, but I like this. I want to work with you on it. And I don't know exactly how it's categorized. It's a kind of a memoir. I've been seeing it listed as a travel book, a Southern Atlantic travel book on lists with like Insider's Guide to Disney World 2025. So it's kind of a travel book and a memoir and a political book all at once. But that's okay. It doesn't have to fit into a niche. A lot of great literature doesn't. Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance. It doesn't really fit into a niche.
But that's fiction. You can at least put it in the fiction section.
Yeah, you could. Although it's a lot of it's nonfiction, right? It's a story. His person wrote another book called Lila, which probably has a little more fiction in it, but still based on events in his life. So anyway, yeah. What is this thing? It's a journey. Is what it is.
Well, it's interesting that you raise the topic of travel books as a genre, because one of the things you lug around on the Appalachian Trail is the old guide. I loved it when you talked about the old guide. Explain that and how you use that as a window.
I know we're just doing audio here, but you can see the old guide right there.
Yes.
I'm showing them on a bookshelf, the 3 old guides. Somebody with the Potomac Appalachian Trail Club, which is one of the clubs. There's about 30 of these clubs that maintain stretches of the 2,200-mile Appalachian Trail. And Patsy is one of the most kind of comprehensive in the mileage that they maintain. Somebody hearing about my trip gave me the Potomac Appalachian Trail Club's guide to the Virginia portion that was published in 1959. So I was born in 1958, so it's kind of like this is a 60th birthday thing. So this is what they were saying about the trail when I was born. And I lugged that with me the first 2/3 of the Appalachian Trail hike until we got to a place where the trail had been significantly rerouted and it was no longer the version that had been done back in the 50s. But it was fascinating to read the old guide, both their advice for camping, like don't wear long pants. Don't wear shorts. They said, don't wear shorts. Are you kidding me? I'm hiking in August. What do you mean don't wear shorts? There were, archaic racial references at the time to segregated facilities, or the refusal to acknowledge, like the campground along the AT in the Shenandoah National Park that was for African Americans. The trail runs right through it, and it's an amazing campground with a lot of amenities now and then, and it doesn't even really get a mention while you cross a road crossing and it says, Mrs. Nellie Linden has a house a half a mile away and will be glad to entertain a camper. That they would tell you about the person down the road who would help you, but not mention that the trail's going right next to a campground for African Americans. Showed that they assumed who would be using the guide, who would be using the trail. And it was still very much a piece of its time. So in that guide, my old guide who came along with me, some things about it were exactly the same when I did it in 2019, 60 years later, and some things about it were completely different.
Yeah, the old guide was totally fascinating. Speaking of genres of books, so this is probably not a Washington memoir in the traditional way that people think about it. Now, one of the staples of the Washington memoir that is not in your book is the index. So when people are browsing bookstores to select a purchase, here in Washington, they will often turn to the index to see if their name is in it.
Are they in it? Yeah.
So your book does a lot of name dropping, but there's no index. So I want to ask you about one name that appears on page 31 to page 53, Jim Comey.
Yes.
Who you call in your book a virtuous but self-absorbed FBI director. Now, as mayor, you actually worked with U.S.
Absolutely.
Attorney James Comey.
Hence the virtuous.
Talk about that experience and then also the important role he plays in your life as documented in your book.
When I was city councilman and mayor, Jim Comey was U.S. Attorney for the Eastern District, or head of the criminal section of the U.S. Attorney's Office, but regardless, played a major role, an important role, and a great role in helping Richmond deal with its gun violence epidemic and bring down a homicide rate. And I think very highly of him as a prosecutor and a person with a moral compass. So now I'm reflecting at one point in the book, I talk about just the experience of being on the national ticket and having FBI Director Comey about 10 days before the election say, well, I need to reopen the case about Hillary's emails.
Can I pause you there?
Yeah.
You mentioned that you are in Tallahassee and you remember the exact spot that you were in. Our listeners probably don't care about this, but I lived in Tallahassee for many years. What was that spot that you were standing in?
I was campaigning in Tallahassee for Hillary Clinton in the ticket in 2016 in October. And I was standing on right outside the courthouse where early voting was going on. So people were coming in to early vote. And I was going over to do an event at the university.
Right across the street from the state capitol.
Yes, right across the street. And I'm just saying hi to voters, and I'm getting ready to go over to the university to, do a talk to a student group. But all of a sudden, when you're on a national ticket, you have a press entourage. And they're usually kind of bored by it because they've heard you give the same speech, 5 times. So they're around. But all of a sudden, they just clumped around me, and it's like, uh-oh, something's up. And they told me, Director Comey has reopened the investigation of Hillary Clinton's emails. This was the Friday, 2 Fridays before the election, so about 10 days before. And we could just watch the polling, particularly in the Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Michigan. We could just watch the polling dwindle because the email story was the head story for the next 10 days. It was the Sunday night before the election. I'm in Green Bay, Wisconsin now. I'm doing an event at the University of Wisconsin, Green Bay. My press clumps around me again, and they says, Director Comey has said they've done the investigation, and no, there's no problem. There was nothing new, no challenging there. But I just had this sinking feeling, but a lot of damage has been done. He made a miscalculation. There were 2 rules that had been established for a good reason by the Department of Justice and the FBI, which is you don't talk about a pending investigation, and you also don't inject controversy right before an election. There was a pending investigation into Donald Trump. Director Comey did not talk about that, and he did not inject controversy right before the election with respect to Donald Trump. He did talk about the Hillary Clinton email story, and that injected controversy. So there was a set of 2 rules. He followed the rules with respect to one candidate and not the other. And look, there's a million factors that lead to an outcome of a race, but we could definitely see the effect that this had on polling, as it was the lead story for essentially the last 10 days of the campaign.
So your book is divided into 3 sections: walk, ride, paddle. The opening of the paddle section is a gripping account of the insurrection. And it's funny because you talk about one of the lessons that you've learned here out in nature is that perhaps it's a good idea to leave your iPhone behind and not carry it with you everywhere, which is a laudable goal.
Yeah.
But on this particular day, to not have your iPhone with you, explain what that experience was like. And I would imagine, from your perspective, this is probably a traumatic experience, going through all of this,
completely.
right? So, how do you sort of capture that in what you're writing here?
So, the paddle, each section starts with, kind of reflections on what's going on in the year. And then, now I'm going to do my paddling trip. The paddling trip was in 2021. So I begin with the start of the year, January 6th. I always have my iPhone with me. I'm too dependent on it, like we all are, especially those of us in politics. But I went into the Senate office very early, and I just remember thinking, I'm going to go over. Ted Cruz is challenging the Arizona election results.
You actually, for the record, you got a whole paragraph of nice things about Ted Cruz. Probably the only book in the bookstore that has a whole paragraph.
Cruz and I came in the Senate at the same time. He and I worked. We filed a bill together last week. This was not a good day for him, in my view. Anyway, we have to troop over to the floor to have the debate about Ted Cruz's objection to Arizona. And I just remember getting up in my office because of the threats. I had told my staff, stay home. My chief of staff, Mike Henry, disobeyed me, and he came in anyway. But it was just Mike and I in the office. And I start to go over to the floor, and I realize, I got my cell phone. But this is important. I don't want to be on camera scrolling through my cell phone when I should be listening and paying attention. So I left my cell phone on the desk. We get there.
And from the gallery, all the press people are trying to say, what's on his phone too? Can I read it?
Yeah, exactly. They do that. Or even just noting, hey, you shouldn't be looking at your phone. This is a big deal. But what it meant was I wasn't getting the warnings that all my other colleagues were getting. Their staffs were texting them, hey, there's an attack on the Capitol. This is getting ugly. I'm sitting there with a smile on my face, blithely listening to the testimony, knowing that shortly we're going to confirm Joe Biden and Kamala Harris as president and vice president. What happens then is Mitt Romney gets up and bolts out of the room. and then immediately turns around and comes back in. Mike Pence is rushed out of the chair, but Chuck Grassley comes in as the president pro tem to preside. I assumed that Pence was getting one last phone call from Donald Trump trying to arm twist him. But then the sergeant of arms takes the stand and says, we have to go into recess. The Capitol is under attack. And that begins a very long 10 hours, maybe 12 hours, where we are first barricaded in the chamber for about 45 minutes to an hour before they can clear a path for us to go over to one of the Senate office buildings to go into a committee room. This is the peak of COVID. 100 senators, 50 Senate staff jammed into this room, everybody wearing a mask except Senator Rand Paul. We're all jammed in there together. They roll in TV monitors and turn on, and now for the first time I can see what this attack looks like. And I'm immediately like, I got to call Ann and call my parents and tell them I'm okay. And I borrowed Martin Heinrich's phone to start making calls. So yeah, I don't leave home without it, I guess is the motto.
But you did learn the lesson out in nature that you don't have to be tied to your phone all the time, perhaps on that day.
Yeah. Yeah, I definitely did. And I have been less yoked to my phone since, although I'm not going to proclaim to be really good at being unyoked from my phone.
But when you are, you're hanging out with all these people with trail names. And I have to say, I was a little jealous. They're not hanging out with Senator Kaine. They're hanging out with Dog Bowl. Yeah. And you're drinking whiskey. You're hanging out by the campfire. You're playing a card game called Quiddler. Mm-hmm. And there was a kind of fun sort of, I guess, thought experiment you were playing, which is a game. What are the most idiotic rock and roll lyrics of all time? Senator Kaine, you didn't answer that question. Unanswered question. Okay. What are the most idiotic lyrics?
I'm going to give you two. One is by somebody who's been knighted, Sir Paul McCartney. The song Live and Let Die contains this lyric: in this ever-changing world in which we live in. Using the word in 3 times in that phrase, like in the world, but in this ever-changing world in which we live in. I mean, they should retract his knighthood just for that. And then the second one that's even more stupid also comes from the British Isles. I think they're from Northern Ireland. Thin Lizzy, Jailbreak. Okay, get
one of my favorite songs.
Yeah, it's a good song. It's got a good riff. But tonight there's going to be a jailbreak somewhere in this town, like maybe near the jail. I mean, like you think,
what town has more than one jail? Right?
Some dumb crook. I didn't mean to give it away. I said somewhere in this town.
Well, now, in the defense of Thin Lizzy, there could be a small jail at the police station and a larger jail near the courthouse.
It's possible, or maybe Jailbreak has a more universal...
He was Irish, too, so maybe Irish culture is a little different. I don't know.
Gale break, I guess, right?
So another interesting detail here along the way, I think this is when you're hiking, you lost 26 pounds, which is an amazing feat. Also, you're drinking a milkshake like every 5 pages. How did that happen?
Well, I try to drink a milkshake every 5 pages. There's a number of instances of going to a place where, like Shangri-La, I expected to find a milkshake machine and it was broken or busted or COVID had closed the place down. You lose a lot of weight on the hike, particularly when I did the hike. The heart of it was in August. We had an unusually long recess in August of 29, and I did like a 13-day section and then a weekend off and maybe a 9-day section, and lost 26 pounds in that stretch. And it was because heat records were being busted. It was over 90 every day, and water was drying up. And that was really a challenge. I'd say of the challenges of the hike, the absence of water was the most significant. And also, you're working so hard, you think you would be just super hungry, but in some ways it's so hot that, almost sometimes the thought of eating made me nauseous. So yeah, I lost 26 pounds in that August stretch. Now, it came back on pretty quickly once I got back to the sedentary United States Senate, but it was the heat and the water were the things that really made you struggle. And then, as I talk about in the hiking section, there's a lot of things to be afraid of. The most fearsome thing is the smallest thing, which is ticks. And I had good fortune.
I thought you were going to say spiders.
Yeah, I hate spiders, and wolf spiders are fearsome, and they would make me afraid. But in terms of something that can really do you harm.
You mentioned one of your Senate colleagues eventually succumbing to something that she caught on a hike, right?
A hike in Virginia. Kay Hagan, a friend of mine from North Carolina. She lost a Senate reelection in 2014, big outdoors person. And she went on a trip to Africa and then came back and shortly thereafter had a encephalitis-like attack, kind of brain attack. And people thought because she'd been in Africa, it must have been something there. And it turned out that wasn't the case. What had happened is she had gone on a hike in southern Virginia and had an unusual tick give her what's called Powassan virus. And that put her into a very bad health situation, nearly comatose. She recovered somewhat, but died a couple years later from a tick. And, you've got Lyme disease from ticks. You've got Rocky Mountain spotted fever. There's a tick that is getting more and more common in Virginia and elsewhere that I can't remember the name of it, but it gives you an allergy to red meat. If you get bit by this tick for a very long time, you eat red meat and you really have problems. So the smallest thing turns out to be the most dangerous. I was fortunate. I didn't have a bad tick encounter on this hike.
So one of the things that happens if you write a book like this over the course of years is your thoughts about things change over that period of time, and America changes over that period of time. So one of the interesting dynamics here is an evolving opinion over things like the name of the street Confederate Avenue in Richmond and our relationship with these statues that are everywhere. Talk about how your thoughts changed about this over this time period.
They definitely changed. So I started this hike in 2019, and I have lived for many years in Richmond and for 30 years in a house in Ginter Park neighborhood, Confederate Avenue. It's Confederate Avenue because the street is where the Confederacy had their intermediate line of defenses protecting the city of Richmond. It wasn't like named after a person, but there's still earthwork berms in the neighborhood when the neighborhood was built. And when I moved onto the street in, I guess it was, 1992, I didn't think that much about it. I was on the Richmond City Council and mayor, and we knew we needed to do some things to kind of reckon with our history. And I viewed it as, I think I write about it this way, I viewed it as an addition problem. The key wasn't changing things or taking things down, but it was adding names, adding statues. When we built a new court building, naming it after a civil rights hero. When we built new bridges, naming it after people of color or people who weren't Confederates. But I kind of got convinced by some staffers of mine in 2020, after the murder of George Floyd, the effort really picked up to tackle the issue of the monuments in Richmond. And one of my staffers said something to me. He goes, look, you don't want to whitewash history. I get that. And you look at the monuments on Monument Avenue as kind of a part of our painful past that we shouldn't whitewash. We should just be honest about it. He said, but for me, my worry is that it's not just part of the past. If we maintain them, we cut the lawn around them, we keep them beautiful, we have light display on them, we market them to tourists. For me, it's not a symbol of a painful past. It's maybe that in the present, we still venerate people who would hold others in slavery. And then that makes me worry about what the future is. And so one of my staffers helped me see it differently. My wife and I then got involved in the effort in our neighborhood. Confederate Avenue is about 4 blocks long, to change the name of the street. And it was interesting, Michael. Here's a lesson. It was pretty easy at that point to get consensus. You're right. We should change the name of the street. But the harder thing was you got to have a new name. And so it was very hard to come up with a new name. I think there might have been 65 houses on our street. People submitted names. There were like 32 name possibilities. And I didn't do this, but my neighbors who did, who set up the process to try to whittle 32 name possibilities down to what it became Laburnum Park Boulevard, was a fascinating little kind of town meetings, democracy in action effort. The neighbors who did that really deserve a lot of thanks because it wasn't easy, but we found a path forward to making a change. And I came to see that merely addition isn't enough. Sometimes it needs to be about subtraction, because you can't change history. You can't undo it. You can't rewrite it. You can't whitewash it. But sometimes you can choose who to honor. And a statue isn't about telling history. A statue is about honoring someone. And people who we honored, 100 years ago, as we look at it now, they're not worthy of being honored.
One of the things you admit to in the book is being an introvert. I think a lot of people would be surprised that someone who has a life in politics could actually be an introvert. I also think there's an interesting relationship between the other senator from Virginia, who is probably a classic extrovert, right?
Yes.
So talk about how you explain this in your book and what it says about you.
If anybody's taken a Myers-Briggs, the way the Myers-Briggs personality test looks at introversion is, where do you get your energy from? Do you get your energy from interacting with others? Do you get your energy from solitude and quiet time?
And you have a lot of solitude in this book.
I wanted solitude. I got more than I bargained for. I've always been a very introverted person, if you measure it that way. I don't have trouble interacting with people, and I derive a lot of joy from interacting with people, but I have to have alone time to recharge. And I think Mark Warner, I think my wife Ann, they are classic extroverts. I'm very much an introvert, and I need time to myself to kind of process and get energy for the next challenge. But as you point out, the hike in this one was 2/3 of it was just me. So it's 42 days over the course of many months. 28 days I'm just by myself hiking. And there were a number of days where I wasn't just hiking by myself, but because it was so hot and there was so little water, I would go day after day after day without even seeing anyone else. And that was a challenge. I thought myself as an introvert. I was looking forward to that solitude, but sometimes it's like, hey, enough of this already. I'd round a corner hoping I would see someone, and I would see 2 deer skittering away. And okay, well, if that's the only company I get, at least it's better than being by myself.
So you don't think of people in public life as being introverted, but they're out there. You're one of them. Another thing you don't really find a lot of in elected officials is that they play any kind of musical instrument. You carry around a blues harp in the key of D, it looks like. Talk about that. So every now and then you whip out your harmonica and you start playing. That must have been something.
It was the only entertainment. I kept the phone off except for, emergency emails or the map to figure out if I felt like how far is it to the spring or to the shelter. I didn't bring any books. The only entertainment I had was the harp. I taught myself to play the harmonic when I was 13. I was jealous of friends who had music lessons and could play instruments. That's not what we did in my family. But I thought, well, maybe I can teach myself something. And I thought, why don't I try the harmonica? And I'm an enthusiastic amateur, but I love playing. I play with bands. Group in DC. I play with a lot of jazz band, a bluegrass group in Richmond.
And you wrote a song as part of this process.
I wrote a song as part of this
and
process.
Your name is actually on the copyright.
It is on the copyright. The song is called Self-Unemployed. It has been recorded in Nashville by kind of a super group, not a group that comes together much, but Daryl Anger on the fiddle and Sierra Hall on the mandolin. Trey Hensley did the vocal on it. Allison Brown on banjo. I played the harp on the tune. But I would just play it. I'd get to the shelter and want to entertain myself. I'd play. Sometimes along the way, got a chance to play with other people who are carrying instruments, or you get to a town, there would be music I'd get to play. And the harmonica, what a perfect instrument, right? I mean, it's not like I play the tuba. I mean,
you can't play a wrong note.
Yeah.
All the notes are the correct notes.
And it's okay to suck. In fact, that's how you make half the notes. It's the one instrument where sucking is just fine. But it's the lightest instrument there is. So if you're going to take something on a camping trip, play the harmonica.
So we talked earlier about how you did not have your iPhone during the insurrection. And there's a lot of this where you are in kind of a news blackout, which has got to be really interesting for a United States senator. At one point, you get out of your news blackout and the president wants to sell Greenland? What is that about? At the end of the book, though, you actually have an interesting sort of thought about this, which is that when you got stuck in your car during that snowstorm, that the social media reaction to that was so intense. And so people reacted to that in a way that they would never react to if you actually had a legislative accomplishment, right?
Yeah.
So, your time out in nature gives you a better understanding of what it means to be tied to our cell phones all the time.
Yeah.
Explain that.
It really, I think we all need a little bit of therapy, like nature therapy, where you're attuned to bird sounds and rushing water or the sound of leaves falling through other leaves in the fall. We are so focused on screens. I mean, it's not unusual to walk into a Senate committee and every person except the witness who is speaking is looking at a screen. And I'm guilty of that. And so the time in nature to kind of try to unplug was extremely helpful from a mental health standpoint. And remember, I'm doing this during COVID and impeachment trials, and I have long COVID that I'm dealing with. It's a very tumultuous time. I think I say in the book that I never could have done this until this point in my life when I'm 65. I never could have done it before. I couldn't have done it when I had kids at home. I couldn't have done it at many points along the way, but I never needed it as much as I needed it right now because what was going on in society was so challenging. What was going on in my work was so challenging. And so I really learned the value of time in nature. There's a Senate gym that's one floor beneath my office in the Senate. I don't think I've been in it once since I came back from that hiking trip in 2019. I do all my exercise outdoors now. If the weather's bad, okay. Like, I don't know, somebody said that there's no such thing as bad weather, only the wrong clothes. You know, you just wear different clothes if it's snowing or if it's raining. And that way you get not only the exercise, but you get the kind of mental health boost of being outdoors and paying attention to the wider world. The trip also really helped me on my 27-hour sojourn on Interstate 95. I'd had to learn how to go hours with no water, hours with no food. And so that trip, I'm trying to get up here for a voting rights meeting. It's in January of 2022. And, you know, it's going to be a snowstorm, but I grew up in the Midwest. I know how to drive in snow. I get on I-95 in Richmond. The sign says, snow, proceed with caution. It doesn't say turn around, stop, danger. I know how to proceed with caution. Turns into a 27-hour trip. I have no food or water in the car. Stuck in the middle of the night, temperature 18 degrees on I-95. A family gives me an orange, and I end up finding a Dr. Pepper when I find a place to get some gas. But what I learned was, I was a cranky commuter for the first 4 or 5 hours of this. I got to get to DC for this meeting. Then I realized this isn't a commute. This is a survival test. I have a third of a tank of gas. It's 18 degrees. We've been stuck for hours. I have no idea when we're going to get unstuck. Okay, how do I survive? When my mind switched from commute to survive, I switched from cranky to, okay, here's a problem I got to solve. And then all this, the nature time and the survival skills from the trip kind of snapped into place, and I figured out how to do it.
One of the drawbacks of not having an index is that you can't mention all the places that you stayed, some of which sound really fun. So I actually did not know until I read your book that the movie Dirty Dancing was filmed at Mountain Lake Lodge in Virginia.
Yes.
Also, you talk about tent site A20. So give some shout outs here to your favorite sort of, you stay at Appalachian Trail hostels and motels, and give our listeners a sense of where they should stay. Give some, give some names here.
I'm going to. So you're right. The names are in the book, but I didn't do an index. I'm too lazy to do it, I guess. Some cool places.
It's a pain.
It is a pain to do an index, right? So cool places on the trail. I'll go each segment. Mountain Home Cabin in Front Royal, great place, great B&B that's right on the trail as it crosses Route 522. Tent site A20 in Loft Mountain Campground on the Blue Ridge, on the Skyline Drive. Amazing. That's a great campground all around. But that particular tent site is renowned. And I guess I could have kept it quiet and kept it as a secret, but I not only listed the number, but I even put a picture of it in the book, and the view is second to none. That the Mountain Lake Hotel in southwest of a little bit west of Roanoke near Newport, Virginia, great place to stay. The Appalachian Trail kind of runs through the property, maybe a mile or so from the hotel itself. That's a great one. Woods Hole Hostel, a quirky log cabin hostel about 400 yards off the trail, south of Parisburg, Virginia. Great place to stay. And then the shelters. Sometimes I'd stay, at a B&B. oftentimes I would stay in this bivvy, this tiny little half tent that I have that only weighs a pound. I'd stay there a lot, but I'd stay in shelters along the trail. And my favorite was the Chestnut Knob Shelter, which is a shelter that is a converted fire warden's cabin at the southern end of Burke's Garden, which is a truly remarkable valley in Tazewell County in Southwest Virginia. So that was one I loved. On the bike trip, we stayed on places, the classic places along the Blue Ridge Parkway and Skyline Drive, Peaks of Otter, Big Meadows. We went in and stayed at Hotel Floyd and heard a bunch of music. So those are some great ones. And then on the canoe trip, a lot of camping, 2 great state parks, James River State Park and Powhatan State Park, camped in both of those places. Stayed at a remarkable B&B in Charles City County, where I had an incredible interaction with the owner. Nanny was her name, and the B&B is North Bend Plantation. And we had a really interesting discussion about her family history and the history of that particular land that had been settled and on which a number of enslaved people worked back in the first part of the 1800s. And her story about the land and about what happened there was one of the most captivating chance encounters I had with anyone on the trip.
So you're hanging out with friends and their children, and at one point like the graybeards are imparting wisdom. This is one of my favorite parts of the book. So these are your suggestions here. And this is not about hiking. This is just about life, right?
Yeah, we're with a guy who's about to graduate from college, the son of one of my friends, Charles and Adam. And he's about to graduate. So Charles and I decide, here's what we should do. We should impart wisdom to you, things we wish we had known when we were 22 years old.
Yeah, it's on page 60. It's the beginning of chapter 15. Never bring a problem only. Always have a proposed solution too. Don't ever burn a bridge unless absolutely necessary. Think long term. Take care with written communication, especially emails. Pick a place to make a difference. Geography matters. The team you work with will be just as if not more important than the work itself. You actually imparted a whole lot of stuff, and that's only part of the paragraph too. Talk a little bit about that. Life lessons as imparted to the children of your friends.
And we had a number of, my kids were with me on some of the journey. My friends' kids who had often done camping with us before were there. And we did some imparting of wisdom, but also, I got to say, it worked in reverse. One of the stretches on the river, I'm going along, it's not with Adam, it's his brother Jason, who is a public high school teacher. And my wife Ann is in the boat with me, and Adam is in the boat with his dad. And my wife Ann is a big educator on the State Board of Education. And we asked Adam, well, what's it like to be a high school teacher now? He's a late 20-something. So tell us about being a high school teacher, but tell us about your high school students. He had taught in an inner city middle school in San Diego, and now he's at a public high school in Hanover, New Hampshire, near Dartmouth. Both public schools, but kind of at the opposite end in terms of wealth and demographic and social class of the students. And we had a fascinating discussion with him where he was talking about his work as a teacher, but also really sharing the stresses and challenges in kids' lives these days, the things that were completely similar about his San Diego and Dartmouth kids, and the things that were completely different for them.
What's interesting, you talk about learning from the younger generation, because you often, I don't want to say critical, but you, at one point in the book, you talk about how some young people have a nature deficit disorder, right?
Yeah.
And this is actually tied to what you were talking about, people being tied to their screens, right? What's the solution to that, or what are strategies that can undermine that?
Yeah, there's the nature deficit disorder. I can't remember the writer who coined that phrase, but it just kind of captures a reality where people are transfixed by screens and spending less time outdoors. If you dig into some of the evidence on it, maybe the evidence doesn't completely support the proposition, particularly since COVID. I think COVID pushed a lot of people outdoors, and they found, I like being outdoors. And so, outdoor outfitters and bike shops and have done generally pretty good business sense. But I think we just really have to be intentional about this. And we have to be intentional about it for a couple of reasons. People who spend time outdoors, it's much better for your health and your mental health. But also, our outdoors need stewards and protectors. And if you don't get into the habit of spending time outdoors, you're probably not going to be a steward or protector of the outdoors. And the best stewards and protectors are people who get into it. I give in the book my parents, a Boy Scout troop at Curie of Ars Catholic Church, Troop 395, and then a middle school shop teacher, Joe McKenzie. Those are the people who early in life kind of got me out into nature and to camping and canoeing. And thank God they did. I mean, they opened up a part of my life that might not have been open otherwise. That's given me such tremendous satisfaction. Not every young person has that in their life. And so creating more opportunities where we can get young people out for their own sake, but also so that we know that we'll have the stewards of our outdoor resources forever. That's really important.
All right, I could go on and on and on, but I need to close this podcast. So I want to ask you about the end of your book, where you talk about how humbling this whole thing has been for you, that's the epiphany, that it's humbling. And you actually go into the etymology of the Latin root word, which comes from being grounded, right?
Yes.
So to talk about what you learned by doing all of this.
What did I learn? Yeah, it was, I in that section right at the end of the epilogue, I'm trying to sum up, what has life in the country been during the time I've done this? What's my Rorschach word? And the word humbling comes to mind. And the root word of humbling is grounded. To be in politics, humbling and humility is not the word we use. We tend to be self-important and puffed up. And we want to talk about American exceptionalism. America's the indispensable nation. That's kind of the way we do things in politics. And yet, if you think from a spiritual standpoint, and I use the phrase from the New Testament, he who humbles himself shall be exalted. He who exalts himself shall be humbled. If the character of humility is an important thing for an individual, is it unimportant for a society? No, I think it should be important for a society. So what does it mean for a society to be humble? And so I grapple with that a little bit. And then I asked the question, okay, that's the word I would think about as life in the country during the last 2 years, with COVID, with the attacks on the Capitol, with the impeachment trial, with racial justice protests. Humbling is what came to mind. And then I said, what do I say about myself in this journey? And the Rorschach word that came to mind was grounding, which is that root word for humbling. I having been in politics, it was 25 years when I started. Now it's 30 years. Getting a grounding experience, it's not all about what bill I'm introducing. It's not all about, the round table or the interview with the, local media. It's not even all just about communications with people. Virginia is gorgeous. It's my adopted state. I moved here 40 years ago. The natural bounty of Virginia, and everybody's got their favorite place. And that's a unifier in a divided time, wanting to protect these beautiful places so that our kids and grandkids can derive the same joy from them that we do. That's a unifier. And I think the grounding experience, I gained some knowledge about our country, and I had some epiphanies about why are certain things going on. I have a long analysis of the book of Job as I'm trying to think about what explains this moment in life and some of the challenges our country is going through. And I think about the book of Job, which offers some incredible wisdom for a book that's 2,500 years old. It shows a very astute understanding of human psychology. And again, it's a story about a person, an allegory about a person, but you can expand its wisdom to thinking about societies as well. You need time to let these thoughts bubble up in your head. If you're just running around doing your schedule every day, sometimes the thoughts don't bubble up or they don't crystallize. And one of the things about the journey is that thoughts that were kind of inchoate or rattling around in my head could kind of connect together and give me a greater understanding about the value of humility, about how to understand the challenges that America and the world are going through right now.
The title of the book is Walk, Ride, Paddle, A Life Outside. He's a U.S. Senator, but if you see him on the trail, you can call him Dog Bull. Tim Kaine, thanks for coming on Pod Virginia.
Michael, glad to do it.
Pod Virginia is a production of Jackleg Media. Our producer is Arian Ballou, and our advertising sales manager is David O'Connell.
Find us on Facebook or Twitter. Subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. And hey, write a review on Apple Podcast. It really helps people find the show.
Make sure to smash the subscribe button so you don't miss the next episode of Pod Virginia.
This podcast is so jackleg.